Hey, welcome everybody to the Trialogues podcast. This is the web's foremost authority on the opinions of Rob, Matthew, and Gaylord. I don't know that we're foremost on anything else, but welcome. It is Thanksgiving week, and I am Robert Hahn of 7DS Associates, also blog at Notorious ROB. And figured I would introduce my partners in crime here before we do anything else. Matthew, Gaylord, you gentlemen there?
Yeah, hi, Rob. I'm calling in from New York today. For those of you that don't know me or are not, unfortunately, regular listeners to our podcast, I'm the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group in Manhattan, which is New York City's largest residential real estate brokerage. I'm basically responsible for anything digital that touches our customers, past, present, and future. So I do a lot of mobile and social work, as well as work on emerging platforms and anything to do with interactivity and user experience.
And I'm Gaylord DeWald, coming to you from Thought Faucet, which is located in the Howard Space Center in Burlington, Vermont. And I'm a consultant, do a lot of web analytics, do a lot of SEO strategy stuff in general, write a column for In the News, and mostly just take all of the good ideas that I hear from Matthew and Rob and pass them off as my own.
Well, we are recording this during Thanksgiving week, and tomorrow is Thanksgiving, so I trust that everyone has various gastronomic sins that they're about to commit. I know our family, we plan on breaking all sorts of diets and potentially laws of physics. But I figure we'd kick this off with just a quick little intro as to, just in the past year, because we've been doing this for a while, what are you guys thankful of? Just give me one thing that you are thankful about today as we're recording this.
Well, this is actually an easy one for me based on what we've recently been through with the storm. I am actually really thankful for electricity. having gone through the storm, the just sort of basic utilities of being in your own house and having things function as you would expect in a normal way is something we're all incredibly grateful and thankful for. Many of us here on the East Coast. So we're very, very thankful just to be back to normal and safe, and nobody was hurt here. So that's definitely on our minds first and foremost right here today.
Gaylord?
Yes, I'm thankful that Sandy didn't get this far north, on that same front, because we got beat up pretty bad in a storm last year, and I sure wasn't looking forward to redoing that. And on a personal kind of angle, I've had a really great year this year, so I'm kind of grateful for that. For having it was a tough year for a lot of people in business, I know, and I'm grateful that I was able to avoid any kind of brunt of any of that kind of stuff, and have had a lot of opportunities to talk to a lot of interesting people, have a lot of interesting conversations. So I'm really grateful for those opportunities.
Awesome. I myself, apart from the standard things to be thankful of, family, friends, everyone's healthy, clients, all of that. The one unique thing I think I'd be thankful for this Thanksgiving, apart from, of course, this podcast, which is just a highlight of my week, is the Fox Sports channel, which I discovered carries soccer. And now that football is only, 3 days a week and is winding down, I think I might have a new sport that I could follow, which is something to be grateful for, through the dark, warm months of winter here in Houston, where it's 80 degrees and sunny outside right now. In any event.
I'm excited for you. It's a whole new world of sport entertainment that is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited for you to...
Yeah, it worries me, though. It's like, it just worries me for some reason. I need to figure out why it worries me. But I have to say, it is kind of interesting to watch it. It's a really interesting sport.
Rob, I think it should worry you because my understanding of soccer is that it involves riots and that kind of thing. And there's a part of me that feels that might be too natural an environment for you. That might be the worrying factor.
Well, my thought is I don't attend live sporting events anyway, no matter what kind. But look, in a continent without war, maybe they need riots, to deal with some of the more excitable young lads who just, need to get violent over something, like, whether it's some whatever or the other team scored a goal. But speaking of thugs and young people who might be rioting in soccer stadiums, I thought today we wanted to talk about something about lifestyle. Namely, and I think the impetus behind it was, Matthew, as I would say, you just launched a brand new website for Corcoran.
Yeah, it's something we've been working on for some time, and we relaunched our website last week. Whole new user experience. A lot of it, certainly in terms of the coverage of it, has focused on a lot of the social integration that we did. So a lot of what you do when you look at listings now sucks in,
right.
Video content from YouTube, from what we've done, and Facebook and Twitter and Foursquare and Tumblr, and kind of everything within the Corcoran ecosystem is now being sort of sucked in around search and listings. So we've done a lot of that stuff, and we did an accompanying ad campaign. Consisted of some print ads and
now, to be clear, Corcoran is not paying us, at least not Gaylord and I, to actually have this podcast about their new website, and it's not going to be necessarily about the new website. But I think it was really interesting because I know the three of us, we really discussed concept of lifestyle search, we've discussed the ideas of what does property search look like, the ideal property search. We've discussed a lot of whether it's leveraging big data, for personal matches, or just leveraging lifestyle in general. And, we know that there are large brands out there. There are companies that are really dedicated to this whole notion of, quote, lifestyle search as kind of a holy grail. So I think what I want to, maybe I'll start it this way. I don't know. First of all, if you had some sort of an ideal in your mind, Matthew, as to what a ideal lifestyle search looks like, how far along that do you think you got with the new Corcoran.com? And if you could give us some examples of what you implemented. You mentioned social, but incorporating the lifestyle elements into it. And then maybe we could talk about what needs to happen for that ideal to kind of take place. So first of all, just lifestyle search. I know it's a big passion of all of ours. As you guys are building out this new website, in what ways did you incorporate that? How close to the ideal do you think you got?
Yeah, I mean, it's always really tricky for me to talk about this kind of stuff because, in one sense, I sort of disagree with the term lifestyle search. I think it's sort of an incredibly broad, vague kind of term. It's a bit like the big data conversation that we had a few weeks ago. Lifestyle search is another one of those sort of phrases of the moment, if you like. It's just in the way that sort of like a lifestyle brand is another kind of similar term to that, because like every brand is some kind of lifestyle brand, I guess. But in terms of actually trying to define what lifestyle search is, when we talk about this kind of stuff internally, and when I talk about it externally on Twitter or Facebook or something with my peers in the industry, one of the things that's really sort of apparent is that it's search almost exclusively predicated upon time spent with content, and search that tries to optimize that particular experience. That as soon as you get it sort of optimizes the process of looking for something and then staying with something, and that's something that we did a lot of internally. It was more a focus on search that moves people horizontally or laterally between different types of content, rather than typing something in, getting search results, and looking at let's say listings, right? In that sort of Google-centric model where it's sort of like 1, 2, 3, and it sort of works vertically, right? You type something in, you get results, you go somewhere else. The lifestyle search aspect for me is more about it's actually slower in nature, because it's closer to something like kind of grazing or browsing, and internally at Cochrane, we sort of summed this up in one of our ads. We said it's the difference between going from searching to finding, because I think that there's a lot of focus on the term search, and especially in the real estate industry, there's a big focus on searching. And if you open up like a service, let's say a syndication service or a brokerage's iPad app or something, usually the first thing you get presented when you enter the search experience is usually a map with like 1,000 pins on it. And there's a big focus on filtering as opposed to actually looking at what you're interested in. So we talk a lot internally about this idea of actually serving a whole lot less, but it's the right kind of stuff. And having that experience almost tailored for the explicit individual in that moment is something that, I think Cochrane in general has been focused on for a long time. A couple of years ago, we had a lot of success with what we did in Foursquare, for example. And that experience is totally dependent upon serving the right information at the right time to the right person in the right place. And we've done a lot of work to sort of refine and enhance that as Foursquare themselves have grown. So as Foursquare start to layer in things like the history of what your friends like to do, or the weather, or the time of day, those things start to actually get tailored more towards your lifestyle. And I sort of use the word in that context instead of, show me where the nearest delis and the banks are. So for me, it's more about moving laterally between content and actually serving up the right stuff in the right time at the right place, rather than a focus on a sort of Google-centric approach, or perhaps like a Zillow or a Trulia approach, which is show me everything and make me filter. And that's sort of how I think about tackling the kind of lifestyle, the lifestyle discussion. I mean, Gaylord, you and I have been back and forth on a lot of this stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, it's been really fun to watch the development of what you've been doing and making over there for a site in particular. And one of the things that I think about, especially as you're describing this idea between a parametric filter search experience versus this lateral search, is sort of there's this ancient web paradigm of browse versus search that's been around, I guess, ever since the first search engines came around, right? Because it used to be the only way to find things online was to follow links. Like you see stuff that you liked, and there were links to other stuff that people liked, like the very ancient roots of the blog roll kind of thing. And then the search engines came around, and then suddenly that way of consuming information online changed to incorporate people, finding directly whatever it was that they could type into the search engine. And from a web analytics standpoint, marketers, we've always understood that there's differences in the behavior of people, like if they are search-oriented versus if they are browse-oriented, because that's one of the ways a lot of the old-school marketers or whatever will think about search versus browse, and what's interesting is that these things, they go back and forth in waves. The first kind of round of the web, in the 90s or whatever, was about browsing well and having everything being very browsable. And then the search engines come along, and then the whole discipline of SEO arises, and understanding how search works to kind of filter on data. And then social comes along, and we start to move back into this kind of browse behavior mode kind of in general. And that's been it's just like an aside, an interesting kind of aspect of what you're building out there. From a web analytics and data perspective, typically we view people who are searching as being more having a clearer picture of what they're looking for. Usually they're better consumers. Like when we put goal values on people, usually we find out search engine visitors are more valuable, or people who perform searches are more valuable. at the very like basic level of like kind of the direct marketing roots of web marketing. A lot of the web is in many cases treated like a direct mail campaign in terms of calculating ROI. And what's interesting for me about what you're doing there at Corcoran Group is you're obviously very brand forward organization. It's an important part of what you do, and it's important not just for the hell of it, but because that's reflective of your marketplace. New York City is conscious of brands, and those things matter to a much greater degree than they would in Wapaton, North Dakota, or something like that. And so it's interesting that way. And what I'm really curious
about the search engine folks, Scalar. Sorry to jump in here. It's interesting what you say about the search engine folks, because in many ways, for a brokerage site, we don't have all the listings, for example.
Right.
So we don't have like our own exclusives. So competing in the sort of Zillow, Trulia, Realtor.com kind of world, it doesn't make sense at all because you can't browse everything.
Right.
But for us, those searches tend to happen elsewhere already, and overwhelmingly so in Google. So when you're assigning values to those that kind of search behavior, we absolutely see that in the data. We make no secret of that the search engine visitors arriving into usually listing pages on a brokerage site, they stay longer and they look at more things, and they're much more inclined to start reaching out to agents and things like that. So also the socially engaged ones as well. The referrals from something like a Facebook or a Twitter, far exceed the metrics that we see from like a syndication portal or something like that. So that engagement level in the search, even prior to arrival, is a very, very important part of this type of conversation. I think a lot of people, certainly in the brokerage community, they tend to silo that discussion and think that people arrive and start searching. And I think it's sort of a myth. I think that very often the search happens elsewhere, and capitalizing on that search behavior, allowing people to do their own searching and filtering and the kind of stuff that we're talking about with lifestyle, offering that as an option, but not prioritizing it is more the interesting play, I think, for the user, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think that's what, like, when I look at what you guys have launched, that's like one of those really intriguing strategic intent pieces that it's clear to me. I mean, I've had the benefit of having conversations with you about it, but that I hope that people, when they look at it, they don't go, oh, yeah, it's real estate search with a little bit of integrated social stuff, and, that's nice. But there's, like, it's clear that there is that this kind of, it's not just like we're going to bolt on a couple of, we're not going to put the Facebook plug-in in and, have our social network, search for houses along with us kind of stuff. It's like there's a real it's a real like embedded piece that you're working with there. And I think
that a lot of people, when they talk about lifestyle content or lifestyle search, we see this time and time again at conferences. What they're actually doing is bolting on some kind of like feed from onboard informatics or some service like that, or like a Walk Score or a Nabewise or one of these other community information type providers, Street Advisor, people like that. They're actually just bolting that on in a sort of modular way rather than really baking it into the experience from the ground level. And I think the more you bake it in, the more retention you have, and all those other kind of metrics that we're looking at. Is that what you mean?
Well, and the more value that the website owner can show, like the more it's interesting you chose the word like silos, because that's sort of how it is. Like, oh well, here's our Walk Score silo and our our housing silo and our where's the nearest coffee shop silo, and it ends up it's kind of like you can't really buy a lifestyle out of a box, and in the same way you can't really like bolt these pieces. And I guess maybe you could, I don't know, some people you could, I suppose. But the idea being that the real value I think that the website owner, the broker has is to say, well, which of these different cues are relevant for my audience? Which of these different cues are relevant for my specific audience? If I can get and maintain the right level of CRM integration, stuff like that, like which of those things, really matter? And that's it's an area, we've often talked about how do brokers compete against the aggregators, or how does the small fish compete against the bigger fish, and that kind of thing. And that's an area that's difficult to, it's an area where at least puts the person or the organization with local knowledge, it gives them the most advantage versus, a larger organization from outside. And getting that kind of, full, it's almost like in some way, have you ever seen people who do oil painting? You can either just take some paint and splash it on the wall, but if you actually start to make layers, if you ever get up close to a painting in a museum, you can see, Dutch Masters stuff or whatever, you could see the way they create that stuff is by layering a wide variety of paints on top of one another, as opposed to just creating a paint by numbers kind of zone. And I feel like a lot of people who approach the idea of lifestyle search online are kind of bolted on. There's a lot of bolting on.
I totally agree. And we, whenever I'm asked about, for example, what we do in social, I use the word layering a lot. It's nice that you use that word, because it's something that resonates really well with me. I think, for example, what Corcoran does on Pinterest is actually a search by room layer around what we do on Tumblr, for example. It's just, it's not bolted on. It's actually just, blended together. It's just on two different platforms. But I know that this is something that Rob and I have spoken about a lot, is this idea of sort of the brokerage websites play versus the syndication play, and whether you choose to compete against that, as many are doing, or whether you sort of concede certain types of behavior as being already happening at scale, and move in a different direction. I mean, Rob, let's bring you in here. What do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I find what you guys talk about absolutely fascinating, and it points to sort of what's best of breed right now. I mean, I've been to the Corcoran site, and as we were talking, I was surfing through it some more. It's a beautiful site, Matthew. So, congratulations, kudos to you and your team.
Thank you, much appreciated.
But I kind of want to go back to what I started this with, which was I still feel like it's still pretty, it's pretty far from the ideal, right? It's pretty far from, what we could imagine as some sort of science fiction type context. And I know what you mean by layers, and I understand that that's sort of the strategy. But especially when you think about comparing it to a syndicator like a Zillow or Trulia or Realtor.com or one of these guys, the critical difference, I guess, in my mind goes something like this. The ideal lifestyle search, in a way, is having a real estate agent who really knows you, knows your family, knows your lifestyle, knows that you've got 3 kids and 2 dogs, knows that you're a big Jets fan or whatever it is. They know all this stuff about you, and having that person going on and doing the search for you. If I say that that's the ideal, so I actually have no work to do. All I have to do is get, sort of really personalized advice from this human being who really knows me, knows my lifestyle, knows my all that, right? Then that's ideal, right? I feel like the syndicators, for them to try and do something like that, it gets into realms of artificial intelligence, right? It gets into realms of Watson and big data and trying to emulate human behavior. For a broker, on the other hand, it feels like that's something they cannot do at this time, at least on an automated basis, because the broker's business is to support the agents. Right? I mean, you can't cut the human being out of that altogether. Right? So let me phrase the question this way to you guys. I don't think that the idea of real estate search, property search, lifestyle search being something like Pandora, for houses. And people have talked about this. Why can't we have Pandora for homes? If you like this type of house, then you might like this type of house. Yeah, I don't know that really works. right? Because I don't know that, no matter how intelligent the machine, no matter how much big data, processing you put behind it, I don't know if machines are really good at that sort of thing, whereas human beings are. At the same time, the challenge for the brokers is, how much of that do you do? Because if you do none of it, if it just becomes if you put up a website or a mobile app or what have you, and it's just this standard parametric search and all you're trying to do is lead gen and push it to an agent so that they can form a relationship, get to know the client, and therefore actually do the quote lifestyle search, that doesn't seem that valuable, right? So I guess that's sort of the question, like, how far could a brokerage whose main mission really is to empower, educate, train, and manage real estate agents, how far could they push it? What is the ideal state there?
Yeah, I'll respond before I'll let Gaylord jump in here. But one of the things that I think is really, kind of at the core of what you're talking about, and perhaps we define lifestyle search this way, is like a level of intuition about what the user wants or doesn't even know what they want. And that's sort of what people allude to when they're talking about Pandora, is this sort of serendipitous, unexpected, magical experience that serves up results that they adore but didn't even search for, right? So there's that side of it. And I think, when it comes to discussing brokerages versus syndicators, I'll go back to what I said before, which is, do you choose to play in the world of show me everything, and it becomes really only a point of differentiation upon design and user experience and who has the best user experience? And that's definitely been a point of competition for the likes of Zillow and Trialogues.com, and you see that sort of user arms race, if you like, heating up inside of mobile apps and, especially inside of the big three's iPad apps, who has the sexiest interface and, the most functionality and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I think is always really tough with that kind of stuff is to do what you're talking about at scale. I think the smaller the brokerage, so if you take something like a Corcoran Group or a Good Life team or a locally franchised group that runs their own website or something like that, the smaller it is, the more niche it is and specific to a market, the easier it becomes. I mean, the big thing about, what you're talking about with lifestyle aggregation is that, to do that at scale, say nationally, you're looking at an enormous amount of data to manage to even populate those particular pages that we're talking about. Whereas, for what we did in Manhattan, a lot of that stuff is like manually curated. Like what we do in Foursquare, we write that stuff ourselves. We work with our agents to, extract it from their heads. It's not, we make our own database of it ultimately, but it's, I can't imagine doing something like that across, 500 different markets. I think it would be almost impossible, especially to do at the kind of quality level that we're talking about in terms of differentiation. So I think the size of the brokerage and doing it at scale becomes part of the achievability of that. I mean, Gaylord, what do you think? You and I have gone back and forth a lot on this on Twitter, right?
Yeah, we're always in it on this one. So one of the things that comes to mind, like the idea of there's like 3 or 4 different themes that kind of weave into this, and one of them being the does it scale conversation that everything kind of comes back to. And I think that someone could achieve a great level of lifestyle market understanding at a national scale, but they would have to have the leadership and commitment to put enough talent into each of the places that they were going to do that. So if you're going to have 500 locations, you need to have 500, different directors of interactive and the content creators in each of those 500 sites. And part of the problem there is that most organizations that are large enough to have achieved a certain scale achieve it, by making sure that everything runs efficiently, and they would see repetition of that. Like, it's hard to see, why would we want to hire, 500 people to to do this locally in each market? Can't we, do some efficiencies and economies of scale stuff? And the reality, I think, is when it comes to lifestyle, is that it doesn't scale. This kind of social stuff doesn't scale, and attempts to make it scale don't work. And that's part of why I think like Zillow and Trulia and that side is going to always it's going to tend to focus on competing on quantity. So sort of the next theme beyond scale when thinking about lifestyle search and data is quantity versus quality.
Yep.
So like Zillow and Trulia are going to compete on their listings-related quantity because that's their advantage, that's their strength. And anybody, anywhere attempting to compete with the aggregators on listing quantity is going to probably lose. And we've seen this kind of argument play out in a variety of industries, not just real estate. And we look back to the late 90s and the race in processing power between the ARM chips and the RISC chips and like the Intel chips between Apple and the PC world, where each side they operate kind of fundamentally differently. But if you just compare them based on the numbers, it doesn't make any sense because the numbers mean different things. So that's another area that needs to be sort of fleshed out. And for organizations that are looking to compete, it's just to identify like what is our strength here, and I feel like there are a number of good examples of real estate brokers that feel that their ability to their position of strength is kind of coming from this qualitative understanding in their marketplace. And, Corcoran would be one example. Good Life Team is another clear one. There's a few others out there too that's what their thing is, and then others are trying to compete on quantity. And so those two different themes, pulling stuff together, is a real big, is a big sort of nut to crack on this idea of lifestyle search and how it all gets layered in.
I totally
and all that
agree.
Stuff.
It's not just the quality of the content either, though. I mean, that's obviously incredibly important. It's also what content. It's like a very heavy level of decision making about what type of content. I mean, one of the things that I often speak about that I think is an issue that hasn't even really been tackled in the real estate industry is neighborhood information. A lot of people, when they talk about neighborhoods, they talk about them as very fixed things. This is what it is like to live here. This is what you can do here. Here's where the banks and the delis are, that kind of stuff. But certainly for like an urban market like Manhattan, neighborhoods are very, very different places based on, things like time of day, like Times Square. Let's pick a touristy example. Times Square is a very different place in the morning than it is in the evening, for example. And surfacing that kind of content appropriately around the user based on what they're doing starts to become very, very important outside of even just a neighborhood type of conversation. It's surfacing, the right information at the right time, and it might be predicated exclusively on the user's history. So if the user, is a frequent visitor to the city, they may know things about the neighborhood that you don't need to surface. They may be a regular visitor to a certain breakfast place. So, trying to compete with here's 10 breakfast recommendations might not be the kind of thing that you would want to surface for that person. But surfacing things based on time of day is absolutely something that is it's like a big area of white space within the real estate industry, I think. Also surfacing things based on weather, the Upper East Side is a very different place when it snows versus when it's, 90 degrees out, as I'm sure exists in pretty much every market. The things to do in a neighborhood change when it rains or not. But most people treat that as a sort of flat plane of information rather than something that's incredibly fluid and sort of shifts around the user.
Hey, let me ask you guys something. Maybe it's a little bit too philosophical or whatever, but I got curious about it while we're talking about this. And you're right in the sense that and I think this is what triggered it. Okay, Times Square is a really different place during the day versus during the night. Weather impacts different areas of Manhattan in a particular way versus not. And then thinking about the overall lifestyle search or this whole notion of focus on lifestyles, I don't think Corcoran, like as a brand, you guys don't really focus on it, although you do it. But a brand like BHG, Better Homes and Gardens, they're certainly out there, sort of really promoting this notion of, lifestyle, understanding lifestyle. It just occurred to me that for whatever reason, the entire concept of lifestyle search, the entire notion of lifestyle marketing, excuse me, certainly has sort of this really upper middle class flavor to it. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I think that just fits into it, right? Like, if you've got enough time on your hands to be more worried about your lifestyle than your life, then you're self-selecting yourself into a certain income bracket.
So I guess that was the question. So the answer is yes. What I was wondering is, because it seems to me like everyone has a lifestyle, right? Whether they call it a lifestyle or not. I mean, if you're living on food stamps and unemployed, that's a lifestyle. It may not be one that anybody wants, but it is a lifestyle, right? But as we use it as the real estate industry thinks about it, when we think about lifestyle marketing, lifestyle branding, it always revolves around these types of, sort of restaurants and schools and, things of that nature, right? And we're talking about sort of, in the evenings, this is the area where you might want to be. And I got to wonder, like, can this notion be extended into, if you will, more middle class or more working class consumers? Or is that no? Because to your point, Gaylord, I mean, if you're just worried about making ends meet, you're not thinking a whole lot about, lifestyle choices and whatnot.
I think it absolutely could. I think the challenge there is there a brokerage that wants to pursue that market, which I think is an even bigger, thornier issue.
Well, it's interesting. Most brokerages have to pursue that market because that's where they are. That's what I'm wondering. Like, so if I were a broker in, say, I don't know, exurbs of Cleveland, I don't really have a choice, right? I mean, that is my market. So does the notion of lifestyle marketing, lifestyle branding, lifestyle search even make sense for a broker like that?
Well, it's a lot of it comes out of a good place to start is the existing customer data, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Who is it that you're currently speaking to, and whether you want to move the needle on that kind of stuff, either up or down, I guess. For one of the things that is of great interest to me is how much aspirational content do you throw into the mix? How much sort of dream big stuff do you present to people, let's say in the news feed in Facebook or that kind of stuff that aspires to, perhaps, or is attainable perhaps only to people with higher incomes, right? And a lot of that existing customer data correlated with the existing web analytics is going to allow you to at least see that framed, to some extent in terms of income level and demographic breakdown, not necessarily psychographic breakdown that you're sort of alluding to. But at least you'll know if it's sort of, leaning towards one gender or another in a way to at least start having that conversation about what you want to do about refining it, right?
Okay, that's a really good point. Okay.
Well, that's where I would start with something like that. Whether lifestyle marketing appeals to middle-class people, I mean, I think every type of lifestyle marketing has the capacity to appeal to, pretty much every demographic. It just is dependent upon sort of content and execution at that point, I think. It's the more interesting conversation for the brokerage is what you want to do with it in terms of where you want it to be. Because it becomes the sort of tactical breakdown of how you actually get there.
Okay.
I think the other one of the stated thoughts is, I'll throw this one in there on lifestyle. The idea behind lifestyle marketing has to do with loyalty, and I think that for someone, a brokerage, in your hypothetical suburbs of Cleveland, that isn't in a upper middle class or above lifestyle to market to, the idea that the benefit of it might be focused particularly on loyalty and building that level of repeat business. But again, I think the primary issue is whether the broker wants to pursue that, for if the numbers add up for them, or if their understanding of their market goes. I think that kind of stuff is a bigger hurdle to approaching the idea of a lifestyle marketing. And I mean, there's a classic example for this kind of stuff, and that's there's a kind of innovation in third world countries, like to go all the way like down the spectrum, say not just like working class or whatever, but let's just go all the way down to, third world countries. There's a whole body of work being done by some guy that's got at MIT focused on innovations for like extremely impoverished nations. Like one of their projects is literally to build a housing unit that can be deployed successfully as a commercial venture, not a nonprofit one, in slums in India. Like what kind of house would they have to build to be successful in that kind of environment? And that's, I think, while that's focused more on a product level than on a lifestyle search or whatever kind of thing, I think that there's enough there that can be learned from those kinds of activities. So I don't think it's an income issue. I think it's more of a business choice, strategic choice that a broker may or may not choose to make.
And a lot of that is defined purely by, the interests. This sales more towards the psychographic stuff, but it's also dependent upon actual trackable behavior. I mean, like the example that definitely comes to mind in New York is foodies. If you are a foodie, you have a certain lifestyle which is not necessarily tied to income level. You can be a foodie and have a love of the very, very high end, sort of Jean-Georges at the Mark kind of fare, or you can be a foodie and be all about food trucks and everything in between. And there's a vibrant culture within Manhattan that actually supports that entire spectrum of that particular sort of lifestyle choice. So and you see certain brands. I mean, Apple is the obvious one that certainly cater to certain lifestyles. These are the people that don't necessarily. There's actually a great piece in this week's version of the magazine app. If you guys aren't reading that, that's like a highly recommended one. It's something Gaylord and I talk a lot about. It's an app called the Magazine for the iPad. But there's a great piece there about Apple people and lifestyle, and the differences between Android people and iOS people. The iOS people, are sort of scornful of the Android people, and the Android people feel sort of very beaten down and sort of bitter and resentful in comparison. But it's about how those two sort of lifestyle choices coexist. How Android people like to have all the decision making up to them, whereas Apple people actually sort of concede certain choices about their operating systems because Apple has already deemed it to be better for them. We're not going to allow you to do this because we think it would suck.
I wonder if Lindsay's popping in a little bit in the chat room and mentioning the different kinds of markets, in particular like suburban ones, and also with Rob's hypotheticals, suburb in the Cleve or whatever. If it's almost like, because I could see how this would go. Like if I was talking to my clients, I'd say, oh yeah, check out this cool stuff that Shabolt and his crew did over at Corcoran Group. It's really awesome. And they'd go, yeah, well, he's in New York, right? Like that's something I think a brokerage would be fair to say. Like I can't do this lifestyle stuff because I'm not in New York. And I wonder.
It's what Jeff Turner calls an edge case. He says Corcoran is an edge case.
Yeah, it is, and it's an edge case on a number of levels. But I wonder whether part of the situation, is one of like New York being what it is, or any like well-defined population place, that has like internationally recognized character, has that kind of advantage just because the topics, like lifestyle is just a collection of topics.
Yeah.
And whether New York, again, being an internationally recognized, city with a lot of character, has more easily definable or easily identified topics than Fargo, North Dakota, for example.
But Taylor, sorry, but that's what I was getting at with you. It's just an upper middle class thing. But I feel like we're ignoring a very important lifestyle brand, right? And maybe there's more for brokers and agents to take away from looking at Starbucks more than they look at Apple.
Right.
Because I agree with, and I think this is what I'm coming to, and that's why I do a podcast. So I learned something. I'm kind of thinking, okay, you're absolutely right about Apple. You're absolutely right about, the foodies and New York being an edge case and all of that. But the underlying idea being that lifestyle search or lifestyle marketing of some sort revolves around the notion of really catering to that person's individual tastes or, their interests, their foodie or what have you, and bringing that sort of level of a higher level of service or a higher level of or something. I don't know what even to call it. Surfing the right content at the right time. And when we talk about like the guys in Cleveland, the suburbs of Cleveland, and they're barely making ends meet, I'm like, there's a Starbucks in the suburbs of Cleveland, and they're selling $5 cups of coffee and making it work. So it's almost like, what are they doing, right? So in a way, I guess what I'm almost wondering, what I'm almost stating as a hypothesis, is that it might be more important for brokerages located in the vast wasteland of, strip mall America to get involved in lifestyle search than it is for corporate. Does that make any sense? Is there any truth to that?
I could follow that line of thinking. One thing I'd throw in on that is you'd mentioned like the idea of lifestyle actually getting to know the person individually, and I think that's the red herring. I think that's the red herring, that if you disregard that then you can find what it is. Because really what you want to do with lifestyle stuff is identify the commonalities, not the individualities. Like a search behavior, like kind of wrap it all the way back to the difference between search and browse. Search is about personalized service. Browse is about community and an interwoven sense of what what is an isness, I guess, of things. So it's like if we were to say, well, I'm not really looking for and I think like this is where Starbucks and TGI Fridays and network television excel, right? Is by figuring out like just the right amount of character to have in something, but still maintain a community around it. Obviously, I think with Starbucks, their product is $5, not $100,000 or $200,000. So that changes things a little bit in terms of their ability to succeed in a different neighborhood. But still, $5 for a cup of coffee is an expensive proposition if you're comparing coffee to coffee. But I wonder whether the issue is one of abandoning this idea that lifestyle search is about the individual, because I don't think that lifestyle search is necessarily about the individual. I think it's more about something else.
Okay, not really good. What do you think, Matthew?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Starbucks example, because that's obviously, if you actually read anything about how Starbucks goes about its brand, there's a great book called The Starbucks Experience, which talks about the sort of history of how the Starbucks brand was built. A lot of it, they talk about this idea of the third place, that a lot of it isn't even really to do with coffee or even the price of the coffee. It's more this idea of this place existing between work and home, essentially. And there's this, like I said, there's this great book by Joseph Michelli, which sort of goes through the principles of how Starbucks goes about doing this and how they're able to essentially invade pretty much every market in the world to achieve this. And this is, he quotes sort of specific examples of this is why the music in Starbucks is so important, and then why they sell the CDs right at the register, why food is downplayed. For example, like people don't go there for lunch, and they don't want you going there for lunch. They want you to sort of go there and and hang out and have it be more of a sort of socialized experience of having a cup of coffee, rather than, you know, picking it up as, you know, as a in the way that you would from like the food truck or something like that. So it's a different type of experience of coffee. But what they've actually done is sort of redefine the experience of you know, how you drink coffee in many ways. Coffee was very sort of popularized by the growth of Starbucks in a way that it had never really been before. And it became much more of a recreational kind of activity rather than sort of functional, let's get up and get going in the morning kind of activity. So, you know, Starbucks is sort of positioning themselves very directly as sort of a lifestyle, as a lifestyle experience. And I'm sort of, you know, using all these examples as in particular relation to their storefronts rather than, you know, Starbucks online or Starbucks in the grocery store, other stuff that they do. But I think that kind of stuff is really, really important. And, you know, is it tailored to the individual, that kind of stuff? I think that's a really interesting thing because, you know, when we talk about like the Fridays or the Olive Garden or, you know, these sort of larger, you know, larger type of establishments, a lot of it, like you say, it's incredibly homogenous, incredibly distilled. And, you know, for like a serious foodie, for example, essentially sort of soulless. But there's just enough character in there, you know, and it's things like the fake Route 66 signs on the wall. And, you know, there's just enough in there, supported very, very heavily by advertising to be able to make it work in, you know, a market where there aren't necessarily an abundance of choices like there are in somewhere like Manhattan. And I think that you know, I for somebody that lives and works in New York, the idea of going to Fridays is not a lifestyle decision. It is a consolation. You know, it's sort of like you do it as like the last resort. You would never go to Fridays. And as a result, you know, a lot of the stores in Manhattan sort of reflect that. You know, there really isn't like a Target in Manhattan or the, you know, Walmart or, you know, those kind of places. I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 Best Buys in Manhattan, you know, and they're sort of shrinking along the way as well. And it's sort of, you know, people just don't do that here. But it's sort of like a really interesting dynamic about how those things actually reflect the characters of the markets, I think. And that's perhaps what we're talking about with lifestyle, is like holding up a mirror to the demographic of the people that actually live in that particular location.
And I think I'm going to agree with that because I know we're kind of running out of time here. But I think what I'm going to try to think about next, and maybe we could pick this up in a future podcast, is this. I think you're absolutely right. But I think back to my own experience of living in New York City and going to school at NYU. And if you've ever been to the Four Corners down in the Village, you know where like the 4 famous cafes are.
Yeah.
I remember thinking when I first really experienced Starbucks after moving out of New York City, I just remember thinking, this is them taking, you know, what's commonplace in the Village, you know, these really cute, beautiful, you know, coffee shops that were serving cappuccino and espresso and, you know, macchiatos and stuff like that, and bringing it to the masses. Right? And you're right, there is something a little bit soulless about it, but essentially taking what the leaders or the pioneers were doing in places like New York, in places, you know, that were these sort of globally significant, you know, cities, and somehow transforming it into an experience for really the masses. And I think Starbucks, better than anybody, has managed to do that in a lifestyle capacity. So I kind of feel like when we're thinking about all this issue of, you know, I don't know, of what real estate and lifestyle search and all these things, in a way, I guess I'm almost saying, you know, again, I'll just sort of preface by saying Corcoran is not paying us to do this, but it almost pays to look at what Corcoran's doing. It almost pays to look at what some of the, you know, brokers who have to compete in those types of markets are doing, and then try to distill out, what about that sort of thing could I bring to my market and sort of popularize it, right? Bring it, quote, to the masses, if you will. Because I think if you can manage that really would set you apart. You know, I think that gives you the sort of same dynamic that a Starbucks would.
I think it's an idea that's pretty universal. I mean, I obviously disagree with Jeff Turner's edge case perception of what Corcoran does. I think the idea of sharing localized, insightful neighborhood information in a way that's highly curated is actually something that applies, far beyond the borders of New York. And just to add one more point about Starbucks, the really interesting thing is when you go to Starbucks in Italy. I used to live in Milan long before my New York days. And of course, Starbucks obviously borrows a lot of Italian language. For example, you order your venti latte and you get served by a barista, and the culture of coffee in Milan, where I lived, was incredibly strong. It really was that sort of true gathering place. You would get like the old guys hanging out there with the espressos, and it was sort of, it had that sort of that real social gathering place that these people had been doing this for decades, and the equipment there had sort of really seen, the real life and real history go through that place. And these places are very, very tiny. And it's always really interesting to see what Starbucks sort of borrowed from that particular culture, having sort of seen somewhat of the original part of it, I guess, if you like. So it's always that sort of that distillation process, and this is, to your point, perhaps another podcast, but that distillation process of like how you take something that sort of has that originality and do it at scale. What do you remove from that process in order to be able to do that in a way that appeals to millions of people rather than the five guys on the corner in the Milan coffee shop that have been going there forever? What do you take from that experience? And I think that's a really, really interesting proposal for the real estate industry. It's like, how do you borrow from other industries to make what you do stronger and differentiated?
Well, I think that's gonna wrap us up. I'm gonna do on my takeaways on this one is to do a lot more thinking about this idea that Rob brought up and that Lindsay also brought up in our back channel conversation about whether this idea of lifestyle search is really actually more important in the places that aren't internationally recognized for their character, as a way of differentiating and identifying and solidifying kind of certain aspects of those communities, whether it's not an important aspect not only of their business but of their existence in a community. I think that and then using good examples of ways to go about it. And I think even though Corcoran hasn't totally bought our souls on this podcast or anything, I think we can all say there's a ton to learn by examining kind of the deeper things that are going on the new Corcoran site. I think point to a lot of cool stuff. With that, I guess we should probably wrap it up. We got the holiday coming on, but what do you guys think we're going to talk about next week? Rob, what do you think we'll talk about next week?
Oh, let's see. After Thanksgiving, I think we'll talk about Black Friday, and I think we'll talk about the incredibly unexpected drop in retail spending, except for online. That's what we're going to talk about. And I think the economy is going to be all over it. I have a feeling that retail and shopping is going to get hammered terrestrial, but I think online, so Amazon.com and all those guys, I think they're going to post the biggest gain, that we've ever seen. I think that's what we talk about.
Cool. Matthew?
Yeah, I was actually going to use the same example, but from a different perspective. One of the things that's always really, really interesting that everybody makes a big deal out of every Black Friday for like the last 2 or 3 years is the growth of mobile. And Black Friday is often used as a benchmark for mobile commerce. And, while Rob is talking about, a lot of the stuff happening online, I think a lot of it is going to happen, or it will be interesting to see how much of it, I should say, is going to happen on the tablet, on the iPad itself. There's a lot more iPads in the world than there were a year ago. And I think that the amount of shopping that happens in mobile is going to be a really, really interesting thing to look at, because those numbers appear to be doubling every single year. And so I'm very curious to look at that kind of data as it comes back next week.
And I think I'll probably be I'll predict a Black Friday conversation as well. I think that one of the aspects that we'll be talking about is going to be the time shifting, the steady march forward of when people start doing their holiday sales, and that kind of aspect as well, to see if any of the numbers that will disappear from Black Friday will actually have been kind of pre-banked in the months leading up to it. So I think there'll be a time shift aspect to that conversation as well. So that is it, and we will, we'll talk to you guys in a little while, in a week or so. Have a safe Thanksgiving, and eat a lot of food. And if you're on a diet, avoid the diet. And
have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yep, take care.